Good morning and welcome to the Land and Community Track at Radically Rural. We're excited to have you join us. So this is day 2 of Radically Rural and the third session in the Land and Community Track. We are really excited about this panel in our third session. It's Native Tribal Nations Leading on Environmental Stewardship is the title. And for format today, we have 3 speakers. We're going to have each one of them who are presenting virtually. And then at the end, we're going to open it up for a broader dialogue and question and answer. And for those who are attending virtually, just really want to encourage you to utilize the chat feature. Please put your questions in there. We will be reading them and addressing them to the speakers at the end of the session. But please feel free to put the questions in as you have them, and we'll be keeping track of that. For the in-person attendees, we will also be doing Q&A, including you in the Q&A. We'll have a microphone that we will be going around to ask questions. And you can also utilize the chat feature. We just ask folks in person to please ensure that the volume on your phone is off if you're utilizing the Socio app. And we just want to thank you all for your patience as we forge through this new technology with a hybrid event here. It's been really successful so far, but we appreciate that there may be some pauses between some of our speakers while we get set up and we transition from one speaker to the next. But you may see a sign come up on the screen that says Radically Rural will return in a moment, and that just means we're going through a slight transition, and we'll be with you in just a moment. So I'd like to start out by just sharing who will be on our panel today, sharing their bios with the 3 people. So first, we have Nikki Cooley, Denneh, and Nikki is Navajo of the Diné Nation and resides in northern Arizona. She is the co-manager of the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, or ITEP, their Tribes and Climate Change program, and the interim assistant director of ITEP, whose goal is to strengthen tribal capacity and sovereignty in environmental and natural resource management through culturally relevant education, research, partnerships, and policy-based services. She works across the continental U.S. and Alaska on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resilience planning with tribal indigenous partners to assist tribal nations in addressing and preparing for climate change impacts. ITEP works in partnership with various federal, nonprofit, academic, and community entities. Nikki has a bachelor's and master's degree in forestry from Northern Arizona University with an emphasis on traditional indigenous knowledges, and she speaks and teaches her children the Denneh language and culture. Nikki loves to garden, hike, raise chickens, and read. Our second speaker is Casey Thornburg, and Casey is the Tribal Climate Science Liaison for the United South and Eastern Tribes. So he serves as the liaison between tribal nations in the Northeast and the Southeast of the United States and Eastern Tribes Incorporated, or USET is the acronym, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and climate science researchers in the U.S. Department of the Interior Climate Adaptation Science Centers to provide current climate science information, to identify climate research needs and priorities, and to provide climate adaptation planning support. He is a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and an educational background in climate science. Casey Thornburg is the program manager of USET's Climate Change Program and Climate Adaptation Planning. Our third speaker is Siobhan Smith, and Siobhan is a member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation and serves as the environmental director. She has worked for the tribe for over 13 years. She began in the tribe's aquaculture program and went on to develop the Shinnecock Environmental Department. As the director, she has helped lead the tribe's ongoing resiliency efforts. She and her staff are recipients of an EPA Region 2 Environmental Champion Award for their work. Over the years, she has formed many partnerships with local groups, government agencies, and sister tribes that have provided a strong support and resource network to aid in the large task at hand. She embraces working with the next generation and learning from their perspectives and new skills. We're absolutely delighted to have this group of panelists with us for this session. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Casey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Thornburg, and I'm Mashi Wampanoag. I wanted to say hello, welcome, and thank you for having myself and my relations and colleagues on for this presentation. We're going to be opening up with some words and prayer. And one of the first things I wanted to do is, of course, acknowledge the nations and the land for which I believe those of you who are in person are. I'm, of course, remoting in from our own land, the land Mashi Wampanoag tribe on Cape Cod, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. But I want to acknowledge where this event is physically taking place. I want to acknowledge the Abenaki nations of the space. The language of the Abenaki nations is of the same language family as ours, but different language. But we have many similar terms. But I understood El Nobak as the original people. I mean, the original people of the land. So I wanted to acknowledge the Abenaki nations, the space of Vermont and New Hampshire and southern Quebec, and acknowledge kind of the even larger confederacy of the Wampanoag, or some are also known as Wampanoag nations that also extend into the space of Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, meaning the people of the Dawnland. So we are all related and connected in that geographic area. So I want to acknowledge that. I'll go ahead and start with a prayer here, and I'm going to be doing this prayer. I'll do some of it in the beginning, just in our language, but the rest in English. Our nation, we are reclaiming our language and wanting to make sure that our children and families within our nation, really have the first opportunity to learn our language. And so this particular prayer, our children are learning in language in school and programs. And if you have the opportunity to attend one of our tribal events, you will probably hear it in language. So, but like I said, I'll do some of the first part in our language, but the rest of the prayer will be done in English. So just wanted to say, it's the first part, Katapatanamu wachi yu kisaka kwanegan. That means thank you for this beautiful day. Creator and ancestors, we thank you for all things. Thank you for the sky. I thank you for the stars. I thank you for the land. I thank you for the rivers. I thank you for the oceans. I thank you for all creatures. I thank you for all of my relations. Help us to see only what is good. Help us to do only what is right. Oh, it is so. Katapatanamu, thank you all. And very honored to be here. And we'll go ahead and pass this along to my relative from Shinnecock, Director Siobhan Smith. Katapatanamu, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Siobhan Smith, and I'm from the Shinnecock Indian Nation, and we are the people at the level land, people at the stony shore. I thank you for this opportunity to be here, and I appreciate you being present in the room to hear the words and to gain a little understanding of what it is that we are actually trying to do, not only in our own nations, but throughout Turtle Island. At this moment, I just would like to take a time to really give thanks and gratitude and appreciate all that we have, all the people that continuously work hard every day to provide not only for the people that are in this time, but for the generations to come. We are always grateful for, particularly the people on the coastal, we're grateful for the water. We're grateful for everything that the water provides us, food, cultural resources, and we just want to continue to work to make sure that those beautiful resources are always there for the generations to come. We hope that in this time, people's minds will open and realize that the different vulnerabilities that each individual community faces is unique to that community. And there is not a one answer resolution, problem solving to all that, but there are things that we can learn from each other. And I just continue to thank everyone, and we just hope that you enjoy the day. And that's it. Thank you. I now turn it over to Nikki for her final words.
Oh, yate bene. Di kon hajonje ne kredo le, di kon hajonje nasi kato le, nike na nish atel indo le, di kon nahasan yadel jinoba dahoid yado le, hot au di bansis kes o dahil di kon inna adel engin kinan nishin khalchenen hik anzade do an yedede da kregi hojonje de kredele hot abansis kes at isago hot awtzin behadesti hojonasli. I said a little Navajo prayer that that was abbreviated. I went out earlier this morning and said a longer one. I gave my offerings of blessings and gratitude to the holy people, and that's how we start the day or any event that we our gathering that we go to. So I just basically said, well, walk in beauty, may we think in beauty, and may we do our work in a harmonious and balanced way, in thinking about our families that are near and far from each other. And so I offered that to everyone around us, including our non-human relatives. And even though we're online virtually, it's really, I feel like I'm there in the room with you guys. I think it would be better if we were. So I just want to say thank you to the people for allowing us this space. Thank you to Casey and Siobhan for those words. It's very meaningful to start it this way. So I hope you all take something from it. But we'll talk a little bit more about it in our presentation. So I'll go ahead and go to my presentation right now. As Amanda was saying, my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about climate change and culture nationwide. But I also want to introduce myself to you very quickly in the Navajo way. We always introduce ourselves this way. We say our clans, and then, so in case there's a Navajo in the room or listening, or even any other tribe, we may be related. So if you are related, let me know in the chat box and whatnot. So kinya ani nishle look at the Denneh bashishin is a sana eta shinale twa head line eta shiche shot twa de do bistot is in the skis de in nasha a kut away the Denneh as son in nishle. I am of the Towering House clan. I'm born for the Reed People clan. My maternal grandfather's matriarchs are from the Water That Flows Together clan. Paternal matriarchs are from the Many Goats clan. And I come from two small communities on the Navajo Nation, Denneh called Shanto and Blue Gap, Arizona. And but I reside in Denneh in Flagstaff, Arizona. Where I come from, it's absolutely beautiful. This is Shanto. If you know Lake Powell or Monument Valley, I'm pretty much right in the middle of it. And in the background, if you can see on the screen, is Black Mesa. And so we share these homelands not just with the Navajo, but with the Hopi, the Paiute, many other tribes that used to migrate through here before the reservation boundaries were drawn. But Black Mesa is also infamous for Peabody Coal Mine, which thankfully has been shut down, and we're working on remediation or a lot of people are really working hard to hold Peabody Coal Mine accountable. As the daughter of a coal miner, I understand both sides of the world, and whatnot. But this is a beautiful picture of early spring in Shanto, primarily pinyon and juniper. And this is my mother's cornfield last year, not this year. So this is 2020. And believe it or not, our cornfields used to be more way larger than that. And we've had to condense it greatly because of climate change. And for us, it's the lack of water, precipitation, and nutrients in the soil. But I just love this photograph that was taken. Both of them were taken by my younger sister, Cooley. So corn, that's our relative right there. And so that corn that's been planted and has been planted is probably have been passed down since before my mother and father were born. So that's over 100 years old, probably before my grandfather and grandmother were born. So I wanted to show you a little glimpse of where I am from. So I'm essentially a visitor in your space, in the tribe's space, that the tribes who are from there. And I'm going to switch to my professional hat. Someone asked me the other day, or didn't ask me, I said something, people were talking about their kind of their professional expertise and whatnot. And I kind of just said, I've been working on climate change since I was growing up on the Navajo Nation. And so I really do infuse a lot of that into my work. I actually have my dream job. I mean, I get to work with amazing people like Amanda, Siobhan, Casey, and others. I'm really grateful for this. So professionally, I work at Northern Arizona University, where my institute is based at. So we're an institute it's just based there. We work with NAU students, but we work with tribes across the nation. And ITEP, Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, we do trainings, online, virtual. We do conference sessions. We have folks out with their climate adaptation plans or their mitigation plans. And we've had the pleasure of working with Siobhan and Casey and many other tribes on just kind of learning about what they're doing, their resilience efforts, but also we love to brag about. So this is just a glimpse of our website of what we're doing, and you can check it out. We'll provide more of that information. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of what tribes are doing across the country, and Siobhan and Casey will give more specific examples of what's going on in your neck of the woods. But I wanted to mention the guidelines for considering traditional knowledges and climate change initiatives. It's a publication written by a number of amazing knowledge holders. And if you go to this page, if you just Google it, it's on there, guidelines for considering traditional knowledges. It really is for our non-Indigenous partners and maybe perhaps Indigenous partners who are wanting to work with tribes and wanted to insert or learn more about the traditional knowledges of the people and how to do that in a respectful way and not really ask for sensitive information. And so this is a really great document, and you can download it, you can use it. It's for anybody to use, because there's a lot of has been a lot of misuse of traditional knowledges out there, because that knowledge belongs to the people. If you ask my mother about the corn, about her weaving, she'll give you simple information. But if she does go deeper into that, those stories are hers. I have no right to use them without her permission or without passing it through my grandparents. My grandmother, who's the matriarch. So a lot of our traditional knowledges, I say knowledges, it's plural. There's not one form of knowledge base in a community. Multiple knowledge holders, multiple foundations of knowledge arise. So men and women, different knowledges, different roles in the tribe. tribe and whatnot. And sometimes those responsibilities or duties are combined. And one of that, I'm showing you photos of, again, what is sacred to us and very significant. You know, we have our cornfields where we grow corn, squash, of different varieties, pumpkins. And it's just recently our people down here have been trying to grow, you know, like other varieties, tomatoes, bell peppers, and you know, all the mainstream vegetables. But this is kind of what we have and still subsist on. Corn. That corn right there was taken from my mother's cornfield, and we'll turn it into kneel down bread, which will dehydrate and dry and save for the winter time. And we'll munch on that. Or it will be used for a ceremony, like the coming of age ceremony for young Navajo. We learn how to cook outside, so a lot of our relatives don't really have stoves. Well, it's too hot inside, so we cook a lot outside. So food is very, very important. It's very much tied to our being, and whether it's apples, pears, it's medicinal plants, it's all infused in our life, in our livelihoods. And you'll see pictures. I'm a recovering river guide. I always have to include a river guide, a river picture. And it's just essential how water is sacred, but also along the banks, we would find different plants that we would use for ceremonies or gatherings. And that's kind of something that I used to teach. And the upper right hand corner is my son. I think he's about 5 or 6 right there, and he's making an offering to the tree there. So we teach them young. My daughter on the lower right hand corner, that is her moccasin, her traditional moccasin with buckskin and cowhide, and that's one of our traditional moccasins that we wear during when we dress in our formal attire, is what I call it. And there's a lot of great examples in the Southwest, where we have these farms that are really thriving and trying to help our people to grow foods. Because on the Navajo Nation, for example, we have 12 grocery stores. We don't have Walmarts. I hope we never get them. Our main store is actually Bash's, and maybe City Market at one point, but Bash's is the equivalent of what you have there up in the Northeast. I forget, maybe like a Piggly Wiggly, or I can't remember, Fry's or Kroger's, you know. So it's and then if you go to the grocery store, sometimes the prices of the fruit, these healthy foods, are higher than processed foods. So a lot of people are doing these amazing gardens. So Loop Family Farms is one of them, and they actually provide families, right, to grow vegetables, and they help them water it, they help cultivate it, they teach them. There's a lot of examples that I can give, but this is one example of what's going on here in the Southwest. Another one is that my relative Roberto Lewis and Black Mesa Coalition are really restoring the food system based on family. Is family. So doesn't just mean the humans, it also means the relatives, our corn, our plants, and the animals. And so here actually employ a lot of youth, and they're trying to restore natural irrigation systems because it's very dry out there. And so they'll try to conserve water as much as possible, and they work with the local elders to try and restore these irrigation systems. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the STAR School, Service to All Relations. My kids just went off to school there. It's the first off-grid school in the nation, run solely by solar and wind power. And these children, majority of Navajo, but we do have Mexican, Japanese, Caucasian, and maybe some Hopi kids. It's right on the Navajo Nation border, but they learn about the traditional foods. They have harvest festivals where they all dress up, and The older kids help butcher sheep if they want to, and the younger kids skin the hide. They try to tan it. They learn how to grind corn. They learn how to cook, make kneel down bread. They're picking sumac berries there to make tea and porridge. They learn how to plant. So farm to table is a big concept there. Love that school. And now I'm going to go into the climate adaptation plans. There's over them in the nation, and they're growing. It could be 80 by now that I know of. There's a lot of people that are trying to still write it approved. The Navajo Nation actually approved an adaptation plan in 2018, and I was very fortunate to sit in on these meetings and whatnot with the community members, and this is what they came out with. These are the priorities: water, feral horses, communication, enforcement and compliance, illegal dumping, grazing management. These are severe problems that we have, in addition to the lack of infrastructural services like emergency rooms, water. My parents just got electricity this year, but we still haul water. So this is think about it, over almost 17 million acres of land that they have to worry about this. So this is kind of an example, just a small example of what they're focusing on and what their priorities are. And the other one I want to mention is the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan in the Northwest. They're Northern California, what is that, the Oregon border, and they're pretty popular because they are focusing a lot on traditional fire regimes, reinstating cultural burning. They don't have a big land base and whatnot, so they're doing amazing things with their traditional knowledges and trying to infuse that into their plan and everyday work. I really like this. They're trying to strengthen their partnerships and interjurisdictional coordination, with like the U.S. Forest Service, with the other non-Indigenous communities that surround them, and so that's really important to them. Food sovereignty, but also they're trying to hold themselves accountability by saying that they want to restore human responsibility and whatnot. So I think that's kind of been lost in a lot of our land care practices. Culture is a big component of this adaptation plan. I would go ahead and Google both of these adaptation plans because they're really different, but they have a lot of similarities too. The other one, we go up to the Northwest in Spokane, Washington. I fell in love with this fish hatchery. A lot of tribes are getting fish hatcheries to restore their, to feed their people, but also to employ their people, engage their youth in one of their traditional foods. If you ever go to the Spokane Fish Hatchery, go inside, and there's the most beautiful artwork that is surrounding these fish, the pools in there. And it was done by some local artists to tell the story about how the salmon came to their people. And they deal a lot with these dams that are clogging up their subsistence foods, which is salmon. And so they're really trying to maintain that part of their culture. And I just was one of the most amazing places. So that's a big part of their resilience adaptation plans. We go to Alaska. There's Alaska. There's over 260 tribes. It's huge. Villages. But I wanted to focus on Oskarville Tribal Climate Adaptation Plan. And when I was reading it, I was really struck by how they emphasize the importance of language, people's voices. If you look at it, there's quotes from people almost on every other page. They really infuse a lot of the elder voices. They're taking a holistic approach by engaging their people, the community members. They're translating words into their language. They never had a word for, I think, resilience, or maybe they have many words for one English word, So I just thought this was so beautiful, and they did a lot of artwork. Again, they're employing their people, they're employing their cultural art into that. And then one of my favorite places up in your neck of the woods I got a chance to go to, and I hope I go back again, is the Aroostook of Micmacs up in Prescott Isle, Maine. They are doing amazing things. Look up their Facebook page because they're expanding. They're doing really great stuff. And we got to visit their tribal fish hatchery that is bringing foods back to their people. It's a small community, but they're really trying to regain that strength from this fish hatchery, which feeds their people. A lot of their waters are contaminated, so they were unable to eat the fish. They were unable to gather and hold and celebrate and hold ceremony, but they're trying to move back to that. They have a fish farm, a garden, beautiful garden, which is expanding. They feed their people, but they also provide it to the local restaurants, like in Caribou, Maine. I ate some green beans, big pot of green beans. Literally, it was huge, and it came from their garden. So they're really building up their economics there too. They're promoting local foods. I just love it. Visit Caribou, Maine. There's a brewery there that buys for. Hopefully they still buy for the Micmacs. These adaptation plans, it says over 55, but there's over 60 now. There's climate assessments, vulnerability assessments, adaptation plans. We have them on our website, on the Tribes and Climate Change website. Casey might have it on his website too. But there's just different examples that are out there, and you'll hear from Casey and Siobhan of the examples in your area. Just kind of like a mind map that we have on our website that you can view. Click on any of these circles and you'll get to where you need to go. The other thing I want to brag about is the status of Tribes and Climate Change report that just came out the end of August. And we were very fortunate to work with a lot of tribes on this to really highlight the voices of Indigenous people and their climate resilience efforts. There's no other report out there like this. The climate assessment, we are a chapter, but this is a whole document, over 300 pages, that celebrates the voices of Indigenous peoples. And like Siobhan was saying, what we are doing and what we have been doing in climate change. One of the highlight in that report, it's free to anyone, it's available, is that the interconnectedness graphic. Casey and many others had a hand in this, but the main people are Coral, Avery, and Molly Tankersley. They drew this graphic, and it shows the nature of all things that are intertwined, like Turtle Island. So it's hard to find a graphic that represents everyone, but I thought they did a really good job. I'm going to skip ahead. And the thing about traditional knowledges and these climate adaptation plans is that they're not just documents that outlines the problems. It celebrates and highlights the efforts of what's been going on in the tribal communities. And they acknowledge and respect all living beings. Animals, insects, all wildlife is not just a, we're not just a sector. It's all interconnected. And we acknowledge our non-human relatives as, as they are a part of that whole graphic, or that whole world. It promotes resilience, strength, and intergenerational teachings. And I'm just so proud to call my next colleague who's going to present here, my colleague and my friend, Casey Thornburg. I think he has some really great stuff to say. And if you have any questions, please look me up. If I can't answer it, I'm going to send you over to Casey. I'm just teasing. It's early here. I'm teasing him. So Casey, go ahead whenever you're ready. I'd like to pass it over to you. So
thank you to my sister from Diné, from Navajo Nation land. Yeah, we sure do. We've known each other for a long time, so we get to tease each other like brother and sister. So thank you. And let me, please bear with me as I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. Okay, I believe this should be good now, and hopefully everyone can see okay. Kwasimu, good morning. Again, my name is Casey Thornburg. I'm assistant of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and I'm the climate program manager and tribal climate science liaison with United South and Eastern Tribes. Going to explain a little bit more about my role through the presentation, so I'll kind of dive right in for the sake of time here. I wanted just to first talk a little bit about my own tribal nation, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Full disclosure, my mother and family grew up here. I grew up away from my tribal nation and community, but made a decision as an adult to move back. So I now live in Mashpee, in our community, and looking to start our family here, so our kids can, be here and be a part of the community and our land and culture. In terms of geography, so our tribal nation is in the northeast and located on Cape Cod. So that's the map that you see up in the top left there. Where you see the red, there is the location of the town of Mashpee, but that's our original reservation, if you will. Our tribal nation has a very long history here. We have been in this place, for more than 10,000 years. We actually saw and, were witness to the receding of the glaciers in the northeast. We have a lot of stories that, as many geophysicists may know, that when you had all these glaciers, many thousands of years ago, a lot of that water was in the glaciers, and global sea level was substantially lower. So what that means is that today, many places where our ancestors lived and came from are under the ocean, places like Nantucket Sound or George's Banks. So we have to not only think about our cultural lands, but seascapes. So our history extends out into areas that are in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, being on the water is very much who we are. Hunting and fishing and being connected to these waterways. Masipi actually means great or large waters, and there's a lot of fresh waters on these places too. So Mashpee Pond is kind of our origin place. As English and other Europeans came, we have experience, and still to an extent to this day, some impacts of colonization. When I talk about our original reservation, in the late 1600s, some may be familiar, there was the so-called King Philip's War in this space. Our tribal nation and community stayed neutral during that time, and after such, the Commonwealth, which was under the jurisdiction of England at that time, granted, this land that was our land anyways, but we could keep like in perpetuity. And that's Mashpee, and that's what that red area is. But over time, our land was certainly coveted for its resources, especially forest. And you'll see a sign on the bottom that says Land of the Wampanoag, incorporated in 1870. And a lot of people, when they come to Mashpee, they see that and like, oh, Mashpee started in 1870. And actually, what happened in 1870 is that our land held in common was abolished by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and tribal citizens, we were all kind of made land owners, and then surplus lands began to be sold out. What that did was, especially if you may have owned land as a tribal citizen and family, but then you had to pay taxes on it, and then debts and things like that incurred, so land started to get sold out. This was a precursor to the Allotment Act, which any who are familiar with larger American Indian tribal history know that that was like a federal act, which had similar consequences, if you will, for other tribal nations across the country, and where reservation lands began to become kind of checkerboarded, and we had these like kind of spread out jurisdictions, and so that occurred with our land, and today we have lands in trust or reservation, but it amounts to about 320 acres. So that's less than a half of a square mile, and it's not contiguous. It's places where we've been able to purchase land back that was originally ours, and then have it placed in trust. We now have some tribal citizens who live on it. We have a housing area, tribal government center, and the Old Indian Church shown here is on our tribal trust lands. But many tribal citizens, including myself, we live in the town of Mashpee, so it's on our ancestral land, but we have kind of these non-contiguous jurisdictions. It's a 4-season climate. The landscape changes. I'm showing the winter scene and the summer scene, and so this climate that we've lived with for generations and thousands of years is very much who we are. So I wanted to share that, and I'm fortunate to be able to live home and work remotely from home and continue to be a part of our nation and community. So I want to start with some key starting points. First is an acknowledgement that tribal nations are the first nations of any place on North, Central, and South America. I'm a geographer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's kind of like the starting point, is wherever you are, you're on tribal nations' land, or land shared by many tribal nations. So kind of just getting that thinking going. It's important to know in the United States that there's a trust and treaty obligation to tribal nations, and a lot has been written on that. There are courses and trainings on understanding what that is, but in a nutshell, it's basically, for all the land that was, taken in its resources to support what would now become the United States from tribal nations, there is an obligation from the United States to support tribal nations and provide resources for tribal nation governments and programs to run, while at the same time supporting the sovereignty of tribal nations to self-determine. So we have a nation superimposed on other nations, and so this trust and treaty obligation is in perpetuity as long, with this United States. And a lot of people don't have the opportunity to learn about that until like adulthood. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's very important to understand tribes as nations with governments and agencies. I like to say that, as the United States, like, for example, has the Environmental Protection Agency, many tribal nations have an environmental, it might be called Environmental Department or Natural Resources Department, but that is essentially an agency that stewards the lands and protects the resources and relatives and communities of that nation. So whether the nation has 500 citizens or 100,000 citizens, tribal nations also are governments with agencies. Tribal nations are sovereigns with the inherent authority to address climate change on our own terms, making decisions on what are our priorities to steward and protect as the climate is changing. And engagement with tribal nations should be on a government to government and partner to partner relationship. And that's, again, coming back to that trust and treaty obligation. I want to talk just a little bit about some challenges I've experienced as a child, but continue to see into adulthood relating to, K through 12 and post-secondary college education in the U.S. As I said earlier, a lot of people, a lot of Americans don't become familiar with the trust and treaty obligation that the United States federal government has to tribal nations until adulthood, or unless they work for the federal government or work specifically with tribal nations. It's not really adequately covered in many K through 12 education. One of the things I've seen as a child kind of growing up, but I continue to see it this day, is information on tribal nations and indigenous peoples always referred to in past tense and in learning materials. And I took this picture because, sometimes when you go to a science museum or a natural history museum, some museums will have like a section on tribal nations and communities or indigenous peoples. And this particular one I was going through, and it, went through different periods, but after European contact, there's this blank space until present. And that's problematic because it's teaching that our history as tribal nations and communities stopped at European contact, when in fact it's not true. I'm here today speaking with you all. And so tribal nation histories continue concurrently with United States history, global history, or the histories of communities, cities, and towns. More materials are needed, by Indigenous authors. There's a lot of materials written about Indigenous peoples, and so, it's every opportunity we have to tell our own stories, and for people to learn from us is, where it's like when you have you're like the expert in your own life, and so having that respect in materials. Often in educational materials, tribal nations are generalized into racial or ethnic groups rather than self-governing nations with citizens, diverse languages, histories, priorities, and cultures. Again, I still see it to this day, having nephews and nieces and people in school saying what Native American groups lived in this place in past tense, and wanting that to be rephrased on what tribal nations are here in this place. So something to think about. And again, lack of understanding of the trust and treaty obligation and tribal sovereignty and self-governance in education materials. Education really focuses on learning about national, state, and international rather than internal sovereigns in North America. So I'll talk about the organization that employs me, United South and Eastern Tribes, also known as USET. USET is a nonprofit intertribal organization established in 1969. Currently serves 33 federally recognized tribal nations, and we're dedicated to enhancing the development of tribal nations, improving the capabilities of tribal governments, and improving the quality of life for Indian people through a variety of technical and supportive programmatic services. So we both advocate on behalf of tribal nations, but also provide direct support services in the tribal health fields, environmental fields, economic development fields. The map shown is the 33 member tribal nations, and the pictures kind of show the history, the originally founding tribal leaders of USET. USET's board of directors are all tribal leaders of the member tribal nations that make up USET. And of course, the pictures, the programmatic staff, which I am a part of, and we work to provide these support services to member tribal nations. So tribal nations and climate change, at USET, we've written a number of comments and statements on it. And so some of these I'll go through is that we acknowledge that climate change impacts the ecosystems, waters, infrastructure, and public safety over tribal nation homelands, seascapes, and communities. Our communities are within or originate And I want to pause there for a moment, because there are tribal nations that have been forced from the original tribal homelands. So in our case in Mashpee, where we are fortunate enough to still live in the place for which we originated. But the point being here is there are tribal nations that may no longer be located in the original homeland, in their original homelands, but yet have still ties to their original homelands. So these are locations for which we are the First Nations of that place, and our culture's health and well-being are intrinsically tied to that place. Massive land cessations by the United States government and ensuing policies have created a situation where tribal homelands are very fixed. So like reservation or trust lands, for example, and these are often a fraction of our original homelands. Why this matters in climate change especially is that particularly like culturally significant species that are adapted to certain climates, maybe we're seeing this a little bit, are migrating with a changing climate, but beyond the reach of our tribal nations for which we are connected. So many of these species and ecosystems are moving, but again, we have these reservation lands that are very fixed. To reacquire land is a tremendous challenge. Historically, many tribal nations face a lot of pushback when we try to purchase or reacquire lands that are originally in our geographic area. And so several tribal nations are at or near sea level and observing sea level rise and coastal erosion. And, with certain projections with sea level rise, some of these locations may be unlivable. And so I was a couple years ago interviewing a tribal leader who talked about, being on the water and being near sea level and having their reservation like right there. And with sea level rise and construction, like they have to do like a perk test before they build anything. And if the saturation point or water levels are too high, they can't build on that area. So if future tribal citizens and housing are not able to build in that area, again, and you're limited to a certain square mile or certain lands, it presents a challenge, and especially in sea level rise. I want to acknowledge and state, tribal nations are resilient and have faced centuries of threats, such as, disease, war, land cessation, expulsion, or environmental contamination, and now climate change. I think it's also important to note that tribal nations have always, been allies to the U.S. to address threats to homeland security, whether it's a war, global pandemics, and climate change. Tribal nation citizens serve in the U.S. Armed Forces at higher rates than other populations. With the current pandemic, my tribal nation, for example, when we had a surplus of the vaccine, we got agreements going to offer the vaccine to the Mashpee Town public school system. So non-tribal folks that are working in the school system, we worked with so they could also get the vaccine. So, and then with climate change, with this knowledge that the knowledges that we have, there's a lot we can offer in adapting to climate change. Tribal nations will lead in climate change adaptation planning, decision-making that concerns our communities and homelands. And again, just that requirement for the U.S. federal government and its agencies to fulfill the trust and treaty obligation to support and implement policies to work with tribal nation governments to address climate change, and especially to make that the funding available. Funding for the trust and treaty obligation is discretionary, meaning it's not a guarantee. And so, it's something to really think about. And again, coming back to geography, being just as aware of locations, history, self-government, and responsibilities to tribal nations as those who work in federal agencies may have for states. And that's kind of like reworking the K through 12 curricula. I'll say one more thing is that when I taught geography in college or my master's program, The curriculum was a lot of these maps of countries and expecting the students, and this happens K through 12 too, to be able to know where these countries are, but we don't have that for tribal nations. There's the same expectation of being aware of where tribal nations are on this continent. So I'm supported by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Program, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that's one of the agencies especially that has the trust and treaty obligation to support tribal nations, and especially in climate change adaptation. There are 8 of us tribal resilience liaisons, and most of us are employed by a regional tribal organization of the region that we work in. So for me, that's United South and Eastern Tribes. But these are my friends and colleagues from across the country. Many of us work with many tribal nations. My colleague and friend Melinda Chase up in Alaska, there are 229 federally recognized nations in Alaska Native villages. So we share the experience of often being spread thin, but working to get information and resources to tribal nations that are dealing with climate change. So the area I work runs from the Northeast down to the Everglades and along the Gulf Coast. There are 2 Climate Adaptation Science Center regions directly over the area, and a third one in the Gulf. I work most closely with the Northeast and Southeast, serving as a liaison between tribal nations and the Climate Adaptation Science Centers in this region. And I work closely with my colleague, April Taylor, in the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, again, connecting tribal nations, specifically the tribal agencies within those nations, to the information at these climate adaptation science centers. I'm going to speed up a little bit for the sake of time here, but just wanted to give some examples of climate change adaptation in the USET region. The top left picture is one of the things that is important is prescribed burning, which many tribal nations across the continent, but especially, but it's also true in the South and East, we have always burned. When in Mashpee and in Massachusetts, when English folks came over, they put in their journals that they observed us do these regular burns on the landscape. And as we've kind of seen across the country, when burns have been suppressed, fuel loads build up and fires become catastrophic. So this is like in the South Florida, Seminole Tribal Florida lands and Miccosukee Tribal Florida lands. They have these prescribed burns to, keep things under control, so when there's drought or risk of wildfire, they don't become catastrophic. The middle picture is from Shinnecock Indian Nation, and I'm going to hold off because I know my relative from Shinnecock will go into more detail on their adaptation strategies. The next picture is of Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead, and it's a little hard to see, but what they're doing here is the community and partners are coming out to plant beach grass on sand dunes here because this road, Lobsterville Road, with sea level rise, if water comes up and over this road, it goes into ecosystems that are of importance to the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead, with species that require certain salinity and things to not exceed that. So they're really working to build these dunes up and protect. It looks like protecting the road, but it's also protecting the ecosystems behind that road. Also continuing to protect traditional plants. In the Southeast, river cane is a native plant species, very important to multiple tribal nations, and so restoring these river cane habitats. And Eastern Band of Cherokee lands, Southern Appalachian, protecting these and stewarding these forests, and also ensuring certain foods and materials from the forest that are important to the tribal nation continue to exist. This final picture here is of the Penobscot River. Penobscot Nation has been working with partners to remove dams that are obsolete to ensure fish passage for alewife and even Atlantic salmon. An ecosystem and species can be resilient if they are free to move. And when they're blocked in, it makes climate change impacts a lot more difficult to be dealt with. So at USET, one of the things that we do, and these are pre-pandemic photos, we do all this work virtually now, or we have been doing it virtually, but we do climate adaptation plan writing retreats for tribal nation staff and tribal agency staff. Many times when you write something, you need a lot of concentrated time, kind of be left alone to like work on it. So this picture here shows these are all staff from actually 4 tribal nations up in the area of Maine, taking the time, this retreat in a few days to get headway on the chapters of their climate adaptation plans that their tribal nation has tasked them to complete. So on the bottom, we do site visits. We were invited by the Seminole Tribe of Florida to look at certain locations that have some vulnerabilities to climate change, and then to go back to the Climate Adaptation Science Center of that region and continue a long relationship to partner with the agencies of Seminole Tribe of Florida in this vulnerability assessment, climate change vulnerability assessment. We continue to do meetings. Again, these are virtual now, but we have climate change conferences for tribal nation leaders and tribal nation program staff. And some of our employees, one shown here, Mr. Tyler Everett, is a forest adaptation technical assistant and a citizen of the Rustic Band and Mi'kmaq. So he does a lot of work in inventorying and seeing what's there and what especially needs protection. So some take-home points. It's important to understand if you're working with tribal nation, like why you're engaging. If you're a federal employee or a director of a federal program, then yes, it's part of the fulfillment of the trust and treaty obligation to work with tribal nations. Or you may be employed by a tribal nation or contract with a tribal nation. So you have duties and responsibilities to support that tribal nation. Maybe you don't work for or contract with a tribal nation, but as you learn, you become aware that the area of your geographic study has things that are priorities to tribal nations of that space, habitat, species. So, connecting with tribal nations, but also respecting their bandwidth to participate. And there might be some personal reasons. I myself worked for my own tribe because I wanted to come home and work and contribute to our nation and people. But even people who aren't citizens of tribal nations, there might be an interest, and in some cases there's long-term relationships and building, and that's really great. But sometimes people may stay for a short period of time and then move on, and that can be a little bit of a challenge too. So it's important to kind of put your cards on the table and why am I here? Why am I doing this work? Again, making sure that government to government relationship is going between federal agencies and state agencies and tribal nation agencies. Respecting the title, roles, and responsibilities. We within USET, we always make sure that ourselves and those we work with address tribal leaders appropriately, like whatever the tribal nation title is, whether it's a governor, chairwoman, chairman, chief, president, counselor. It's having that same respect that you would for like the president of the United States or a representative of Congress. You have that same respect for a tribal nation leader, or a representative of council. And so also recognizing that tribal leaders, directors, and program staff have obligations. And most importantly, at the end of the day, we're accountable to our own tribal nation and community, first and foremost. Relationship building takes a lot of time, oftentimes than academic and grant deadlines allow. So I want to avoid situations where I've got this grant and I would like this tribal agency or staff to sign off on it. The relationship building is where you really get to know one another and what's a priority, and it's better to do that on the front end. And then if there are opportunities to go in on grants and programs together, that's good because you already have that relationship built. Sometimes tribal nations and programs are inundated with inquiries, so kind of keeping that in mind. And just like any sovereign nation, major decisions and commitments require authorization from governing bodies. So again, any relationship or a grant application or something, when I work for my tribal nation, I would have to go to council and say, what are we signing ourselves up for? And keeping that in mind. So again, agreements, contracts take time. Traditional knowledge, I think my relative Nikki from Diné land, Diné Pekea, said it well. And, you know, respecting that the traditional knowledge comes from the tribal nation and people within that tribal nation. So being very respectful of that. I think in academia, sometimes what we do is we cite things. We're told, you know, it's important to cite your sources. I think in a traditional knowledge aspect, we kind of do that mentally too. It might not be oral, it might not be written, but orally it's like, well, I got this knowledge from my uncle who got this knowledge from his father who got this knowledge, so on and so forth. So you have that same level of respect of knowledge. It's shared, but also respecting the right that tribal nations may not feel in the best interest to share certain traditional knowledge, you know, so that's also important to be mindful of, and being clear and transparent on how traditional knowledge will be part of any project. This is my last slide here, and we did we had a virtual climate change camp. It was a virtual camp, so everyone kind of zoomed in, and this was both with tribal nation agency staff and scientists, both native and non-native scientists from climate adaptation science centers and universities, putting like, what is optimal engagement in one word with tribal nations and non-tribal partners on climate change. And some of these big ones were like awareness and history and patience, time, respect, sensitivity, and tradition. So Katapatanamu, thank you very much. And I'd like to go ahead and hand this over to my relative director, Siobhan Smith from Shinnecock.
So I just want to say thank you again for having me. The invitation is Resilient Shinnecock. I appreciated listening to Nikki and Casey's presentations. I always enjoy listening to the other panelists, and it's always a great leadway into my presentation because they give a lot of that background information. And mine is a little more specific. Mine is an example of how a tribe is actually implementing their climate change adaptation plan. Our tribe had one of the earlier climate adaptation plans. And I remember one of my actual first times discussing it was all the way back in 2015. And that's when I first met Nikki. And so since then, we've actually been in the process of not only updating our plan, but doing some of that implementation work. So today I'm going to just share a little bit of the work we've been doing. I always like to begin on my presentations by really just explaining to people where the Shinnecock Indian Nation is. It's a smaller tribe and it's not as known as some of the larger tribes, but we are here on the eastern seaboard. We're located on the eastern end of Long Island in the state of New York. As you can see here, Shinnecock is a peninsula and it's surrounded by water on three sides. So we have to the east, we have to the west, we have Old Fort Pond, and down towards the southwest, what is known as Shinnecock Bay. And so I don't know if you can see my mouse right here, but this barrier island is Dune Road, and that's the only thing that separates the Shinnecock Bay from the Atlantic Ocean. The area that we have remaining of our Aboriginal territory, because always remember that this isn't the complete land base that we lived on, and we weren't one area, but what we have left is what we refer to as the neck. And so that's where everyone, half of the tribal population resides on Shinnecock Peninsula right here. We have additional lands about 15 minutes away in an area, actually also shoreline property, but it touches the Wampanoag estuary and goes to the Long Island Sound, and was one of our traditional travel routes when we used to go visit our cousins to the north there, over there, Mashpee, Narragansett, Pequot tribal nations. So here I have just a very list of some of our climate change concerns, right? It's not an extensive list. I just tried to summarize a little bit. So being a shoreline people, we are concerned about shoreline erosion, sea level rise, the harmful algal blooms, water quality, wetland migration, and land conservation. So they are overlapping and they're all connected, and they're having significant impact, not as strong as in some areas of the country, but nonetheless, these are our vulnerabilities and our concerns. So one of the major things we wanted to address early on was the significant beach that we had lost, the amount of sand that was being pulled out into the water, whether it be by wave action, simply just blowing, and accretion somewhere else. And so this picture here on my left is what the beach looked like prior to our first mitigation effort. And so we had worked with a GIS specialist from a sister tribe who really helped us look at some old aerials, and we were able to identify that in some areas of the Shinnecock shoreline, there had been a loss of up to like 150 feet of beach sand area. And then this picture here on the right is what the beach currently looks like after the project. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we got from, our area that really had the significant loss of sand to being able to say we've created a little more of a buffer between ourselves and the surrounding water body. So here you see that we had over 30,000 cubic yards of dredged sand. So I showed you the island, the barrier island early to show you the Atlantic Ocean. So in between that barrier island, going back to actually the hurricane of 1938, there was a huge hurricane that actually created like a little breach in that barrier island. And so that's what brought a lot of the wave energy onto Shinnecock Bay, a lot more salinity. So it really changed the bay, it changed the ecosystem. And a lot of the elders say that's when they noticed the sand loss actually had began to occur. So one of the things why that story is also important is because routinely Suffolk County does what they call an inlet maintenance dredge. So where that breach occurred, they now use it for access for boats to come in and out between the Atlantic Ocean and Shinnecock Bay. And so what you see right here is this equipment. What they did was they took this, it was like about a little less than a mile long pipe that was essentially just rolling through the area, pumping all the sand onto the shoreline. So all this here is just massive sand being pumped out from the bay bottom by the inlet on Shinnecock shoreline. And this process was continuous for, it was like 2 weeks, basically around the clock. They just was out there just pumping sand continually. And then we had a short period of time where no one was allowed on the beach. They had closed the beach to give it time to settle so that there wouldn't be any possibility that there might be any sinkholes, posing a threat to any tribal member that might be walking out on the beach and possibly fall into a sand pile. That would be a tragic accident. So we had to wait for the sand to settle, and they smoothed it out and so forth. And so one of the things that once we did the beach nourishment, then it became necessary to how do you go ahead and help the sand stay in place? Because all those factors that were causing the erosion are still there, right? We still have the wave energy. We're still always going to have wind. And so it's actually the wave energy begins to increase the more and more there's storm activity surrounding climate change in the Atlantic Ocean and having access through the inlet. So we're always mindful that, yes, we did a tremendous effort by getting the sand on the beach, but the monitoring and the maintenance is the work that's still in front of us. And there will come a point in time when we're going to have to go ahead and think about whether or not we have to apply more sand to the beach. and in different locations. It's going to be an ongoing process given that it's a peninsula. Some sides are a little more affected than others. So here you'll see one of the partners that we had was the Cornell Cooperative Extension, and this is their marine program, very instrumental in assisting the tribe bring this project to fruition. So one of the things that really speaks to, knowledge of where you live and how you want to see your plans implemented is that the tribe early on knew that we wanted to maintain the natural aesthetic of what the beach looked like. We didn't want to have the hard armoring, and we didn't want, the sea walls and all that. We really wanted to just put back what was there the best we could and create that natural feel while still trying to protect ourselves from the continuous impending sea. So this is showing literally these plants were hand planted along over 3,000 feet of the shoreline. So this is the work as it's taking place. And then if you look to this side, this is a recent picture. This picture was just taken actually, I took this picture back in March, and you can see that the grass has just been tremendously flourishing. These plants, we've been so fortunate. They're really just taken off and, really helping to hold the sand in place. I should say to you that the difference in this time, so this picture is like 2016. And like I said, so about 5 years later is where this picture is. So one of the really important aspects of Shinnecock life is that shellfish is a tremendous component of our cultural ways. So not only are we talking about oysters and clams and mussels and scallops, so it's a source of food that we get directly from the water. It's a source of, like the clam shells are used to make wampum. So it's a part of jewelry, the way we decorate ourselves, the way we shift with other people. There's times when you have visitors or you're going somewhere to visit, you'll give them, excuse me, a gift of wampum. And so we also use them in this instance. It's actually helping to protect our shoreline. So what you see here is these are bags and bags of fossilized shell that were actually mined like down in Florida and transported up to help us build our oyster reef. These bags were, Cornell took these bags after we bagged them up, and they took them to their hatchery and applied. When we say 1 million oyster spat, it really is an estimate. So the goal was to get 1 million oysters onto these shells. And then we came and so we dropped the bags down. There was the base bags that did not have oysters on them at all. They were just the shells. And then the top layer. So this photo, this slide right here. So we were fortunate, as I said, we had one of the earlier climate change adaptation plans, and it wasn't as sophisticated, detailed as some of the newer ones that are now, but it served its purpose. And we have been able to get a lot of work done behind that document. We've been able to use that document really to leverage some of our funding requests to help us get more resources to continue the work that we need to protect our homeland. And so this right here is so the excuse me, the part of Shinnecock that's over towards the west is touching, I told you before, the Peconic estuary. So it goes out into the Long Island Sound and so forth. The Peconic estuary is one of the national estuaries of significance, basically. And so the Peconic Estuary Program was able to get funding from EPA to complete a vulnerability assessment for the area. And because we have significance to the area, and we are one of the stakeholders in the area, and we're one of the identified populations, we were able to receive the benefit of working with a consultant. And so that consultant came out and was really trying to just help us update the current plan that we have and really assess what we've addressed, what we need to continue looking at, and really talk with the different tribal departments to identify some of those new climate stressors that we may not have identified all the way back in 2013, 2014, when we did the first plan. And so this here is just one of the different graphics that they shared with us showing the potential for sea level rise. And so sometimes people, when they think about sea level rise and the impact it might have on a community, or in a couple of slides, I'm going to talk about migrating wetlands and the fact that it seems like it really is a small land base, but you have to remember that it's all the land that we have remaining. And so the fact that we're fighting the erosion and we're fighting sea level rise and migrating wetlands, it will all have an impact on where we're able to continue to live, build future homes, provide for the future generations, all while making sure we also maintain a natural habitat for the animals and plant life that we share the area with. So all of this comes together, and it's all important that we keep all of that in mind when we're making our plans. So I apologize. When I had to relink on, I forgot to close my email again. So that's what the dinging is. Photograph here is because I wanted you to also get a visual of how sea level rise is going to be impacting our lands. And these pictures here, these are two tidal ponds that are on either side of, unfortunately, our cemetery. Our cemetery was not always originally on a water site, but when we were pushed just here to remain on the neck, we lost our traditional burial grounds. And so we had to find another place at that time to bury our loved ones and our ancestors. And so we're at this area, and this photo after a significant amount of rain, and it's kind of hard to see, but I wanted you to see where the leaves are here. This is where the water's coming up. And so the fact that those ones are really just growing more and more and more is posing a threat, not only to the houses that are built in the back, the residential area, but actually to our burial grounds. And so there may become a point in time where we have to really consider if we in any way mitigate this and slow this down. Unfortunately, making that hard decision to perhaps relocate people. And so when you think of climate change, I just wanted to hone in that there is some aspects of it that is very emotional, and it's not just flooding storm drains and streets. Like there's a lot that actually goes into it that is significant and has a lot of emotion attached to it. So keeping with our theme of water quality, shoreline, coastal people, one of the things that we're also being very mindful is of harmful algal blooms. And so as we move to a point in time where there's more nitrogen and phosphorus being loaded into the waterways from storm runoff, and here we have, it's like most of the homes on Long Island have literal cesspools. And I know that sometimes things like that are regional, so people don't always know what a cesspool is, but people in the Northeast, I believe, do. It's literally like a hole, and usually it's like brick lined, and it comes from your house and it captures all your wastewater. And so initially, years and years and years ago, when they installed these, they thought that the sand on Long Island was going to help filter that water, and so that it wouldn't impact the groundwater that eventually went out to the surface water. And over the years, they found that that's not necessarily true. It's not true at all. And so it's actually contributing to these algal blooms that are taking place, that mixed with the water warming. So the warming temperatures and the nutrient loading is feeding some of these algae that have very toxic effects. So there are several types of harmful algal blooms. They are the ones that impact the shellfish, but they only kill the shellfish. And I don't want to say only, because that is also has tremendous implications to human health and cultural ways and subsistence living, but they kill the shellfish. Then there are the other harmful algal blooms that are more of a direct impact on human health. So, for instance, there's paralytic shellfish poisoning. So, if you eat shellfish that has eaten the algae that's producing this toxin, that could potentially be your life there. And so, when we talk about these things, we have to realize the impact that what we do on land is eventually reaching these waterways, and it's having an impact on the ecosystem, and it's part of the food web, part of the food chain, and it's a direct impact on human health. And so one of the things that we are doing here in the environmental department for Shinnecock is really trying to work with EPA and through their citizen science program, which really is a great supplement to the resources and the equipment, the monitoring equipment that we ourselves have access to, because these things become very expensive and they require a certain expertise to use them. So while we're building our capacity, these partnerships have been instrumental in the work that we do, where we're really the next step will be to look at the different nutrients that are feeding the water, but also identify the source. And then look to see how we might address the source. Is it human? Is it animal? Waterfowls and so forth. And so really, that's just a part of the long work that's ahead of us to really make plans and decisions to prepare for our future. We are upgrading our individual systems. We've been fortunate to work with Indian Health Services so that we can remove all those old cesspools and really upgrade all the systems to a septic fields and septic tanks and nitrogen removing systems, so that it doesn't just leach into the groundwater and then eventually make its way out to the surface waters. Here we have, so when we think about sea level rise, we think about water table, we think about saltwater intrusion. And so here we have some tribal staff that has been working with the USGS. We also have worked with the Suffolk County Health Department, and we have these groundwater level monitoring network now. And so let me show you. These are our observation wells. And so we're in the beginning stages. We've been doing this for maybe about 3 years now. And really what happens is we have the first component of this is we have these meters that we lower down into these wells, and then they beep. They basically give off a signal that lets you know when you've hit water. And so we're tracking the water table and how it changes with the tide, how it's changing over time. And then eventually we'll also be taking water samples directly from the groundwater to identify any pollutants that might be in the water, anything that's passing. We actually also want to know what's passing to the north of us and coming through Shinnecock territory. What's here, what are we picking up, and then what's going out into the bay. So this is just some of the many things that one of the many things that we are doing here to not only better understand what's happening on Shinnecock, but what outside sources are impacting Shinnecock. This is a great picture of an aerial shot for our wetland. One of the things here I wanted to show you, these trenches right here they're actually from back in the 70s, the 60s, when Suffolk County put these trenches here, because what they wanted to do was create a way for the fish to come through. And so the hope was that the fish would eat the mosquito larvae, and so then reduce the mosquito population. And it's like when you know better, you do better. But now we just have all these residual trenches that are there, and they actually, when the tide's out, it feels like it makes more habitat for mosquito. So I showed you the picture of the wetland to talk about our next concern, which would be wetland migration, which is a natural phenomenon. It's going to occur. It is occurring. We're going to be working with the Nature Conservancy to really take a look at this and plan for this. Because as I mentioned before, we're talking about this this being the only land base that we currently have to provide a home for our tribal members and all the wildlife that we share it with. And so when we begin to realize that not only are we dealing with the erosion at the shoreline and the continuous influx of wave energy and storm surge, so the wetlands are important because they provide that buffer, right? So we all, well, I don't want to say, but it's known that the wetlands act basically as a sponge and kind of soak up some of that storm surge. So while we need them and while they're vital and important to our survival here on this land base, at the same time, their migration northward is going to impact where tribal members will be able to live and where it's changing the different plant life. So the trees, the wooded areas that we have and are also important to our ecosystem and our cultural resources, they're beginning to die off. And what we're going to have is more of these marshland type plants that are going to begin to take over that area. And so this is something that we're looking to begin. Oh, that's not the right slide. I'm sorry. That's okay. We're beginning to work with the Nature Conservancy to go ahead and monitor that. So not only do wetlands tend to move northward, but then you also, we're going to monitor the elevation. So as storm water comes in, it brings sediment with it. And so the sediment oftentimes is deposited. There's also the sediment that comes from storm runoff. And so the marshlands are moving north, but they're also growing up. And so what this slide here represents is now I'm moving my discussion towards what are the things that we're going to continue to work on moving forward. And so one of them happens to be this continuous shoreline monitoring. So we know that the sand is not going to stay there indefinitely. That's not the way Mother Nature works. That's not the way climate change is not going to allow that to happen. There's going to be the continued storm surge. There's going to be the increase in wave energy. There's always going to be wind. Some of our plants may not always thrive. You see these have actually behind, here's this little stand, but behind there, some of the plants have actually unfortunately been trampled on from human traffic. And so that has decreased the abundance of plants that could be there holding that sand. So we're going to continue to work with such partners as USGS and using equipment that will measure where the sand is moving to, the elevation of the sand, the dunes, and really help us judge. So we'll use that information to say, okay, so do we need to, where do we need to extend our oyster reef? Do we maybe need to make it higher? Do we maybe need to change the angle of it? So all of the information that we're going to begin to gather is going to really help us adjust the system that we put in place to make it work better, because, that's what really science is. It's trial and error and hope for the best. So this, I wanted to show you the picture, basically how the sand has already started changing. And it was back in January, there was this, another indication of how the weather systems really are changing regionally. So this is not really an area that's known for having tornadoes. And yet we're getting more and more of these tornado warnings that are accompanying some of these storms. So back in January, we received a tornado warning. We didn't actually get a tornado that touched down in our area, but the amount of wind and wave energy that it brought, we were able to see how it had really chipped away at some of that sand that was on this little bluff in front of the cemetery. And so even just capturing pictures and documenting the changes are what's going to be important in helping us move forward and make decisions of where to add more sand, what to put in front of that sand, maybe increase the number of plants that have gone that go on the dune, or like I said, adjusting how the oyster reef is built. This is actually the slide that I thought was after the wetlands, so I do apologize for that. But this was just an example of the elevation table that the Nature Conservancy is going to come in and install at various points along the Shinnecock Peninsula. And this will give us an indication of how the wetland is moving in height. And this will be tied into a network so that that information is continuous throughout Long Island. So when we talk about land management, land conservation, land use, it's the importance of recognizing that there are all these, I don't want to use the word competing, but there are all these different interests, necessities that are all overlapping, and it's about finding the balance. So I appreciated Casey's discussion earlier where he was talking about tribal governments and sovereign nations. And, it's more than just being a community and a neighborhood. So you have to account for all of these things that you're going to need, your housing, areas, recreation, areas, protecting your culturally significant areas, making sure that you still have preserved open space that provides for all the plants, all the animals, everything that belongs here and we share the space with, while at the same time providing opportunities of economic development, because people still need to live in a modern world. And so there are different resources that you have to have access to. And so then, just the nature of making sure that you're mindful of all of that is it's a lot. It's a lot. And it's not something that's taken lightly. It's something that is really vital to our existence and survival. We are fortunate to be a land-based people, and so we're doing what we can to actually preserve this and keep this here and strong. I just wanted to, share a couple of pictures of some of the plants and animals and the shellfish and all this that we share this space with, which, sources, but, there's also the different uses for each of the animals, each of the plants. There are the medicinal purposes of some of the plants. Some of the animals are also used for our traditional clothing. So it's a multi-use, you have your food source from that animal. You have some of your cultural resources from that animal for your clothing. You have some of your tool uses, jewelry making. A lot of times we'll take these quahog shells right here after we've eaten the meat that's inside, and then you just create little hand rattles. And, lots of times the children are always making them in the different programs, and we use them at our socials. So you see right there is that multi-purpose for that one particular item. It was a food source. It's a cultural resource, jewelry making, musical instrument. There are some old Shinnecock people, they just take the clamshells and use them to fill your driveways. You get little potholes because, we don't have a lot of paved driveways. A lot of people just have dirt driveways, and, the ground naturally settles. So they go ahead and throw some clamshells and oyster shells out there and use them to fill the holes. So reaching the end of my presentation here. And so some of the things that I just wanted to hear, let me just show you this right here. So this is what the project looks like overhead. So here's the sand, the stretcher beach. We had this fencing, and then here are the plants coming in. This is that tidal pond that I was telling you about. It wraps this way, but the opening is actually in the shot that you can't see. And one of the things that the project did do, though, was kind of open the access to that pond a little more, because during Hurricane Sandy, these ponds filled up with water so quickly. It went into really went into the homes here and in their basements, but it didn't have any way to drain out. So it kind of just stayed there for a long time. It took a while for the water to recede. And so the project really took a look at that and kind of opened it. So now there's more of a natural flow. So it didn't stop the water from filling in there, but it will quicken its ability to leave. So as I said, we're going to continue to track the sand movement. We're going to continue building our oyster reef and the planting. We're getting ready to do some wetland monitoring work and develop a wetland monitoring program. And we're going to do a pilot project where we're going to really begin to try to identify what plants will be able to live in that area that's kind of in between where the trees are dying off and we're getting just more of these marsh-like grasses and plants, but really try to find some trees to really hold the space a little better, so that we don't continue to lose too much. I just also wanted to just reiterate how important it is when you're working on these type of projects, to reach out to surrounding communities, different agencies, nonprofits, other tribes, and really create a network of resources for yourself. And resources is not always financial. Resources is your technical assistance, your technical support. A lot of times you get access to equipment that you may not be able to afford on your program's budget. Sometimes you just get people that you can sit in a room with and brainstorm. And so all of those relationships that you build over time become very valuable and really help you continue to launch your work and really do some of that implementation of these climate adaptation plans that are being drafted. Because one of the biggest things is finding the resources to do that implementation work. So once you even identify what your concerns are and you get them out on paper, and then you get the steps that you would take to hopefully mitigate that vulnerability, then comes the other part of finding those resources. And so I just want to reiterate that those partnerships and networking is really really vital and important. And even if you are a person who has those resources, be on the lookout for when people are inquiring and looking for people to help, because you never know what you can bring to the table. Your skill set could be in a very important missing component to someone who's just trying to put all this together and figure things out. Just one more overhead shot. So this is see, now you can see it a little better. This is one of those tidal ponds, but here you see where we trenched it out a little bit. So this fills out periodically whenever there's the storm. So what really is feeding this is not just the water that's coming in from the bay, but this is really also about groundwater coming up, right? So when we talk about monitoring the ground table, we talk about movement of the ground table, increased ground table, sea level rise, all that feeds into what this is. But hopefully having an opening will keep it from, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Will give it the way to get out so it doesn't remain here and get stagnant water and just continue to grow and grow and really just move into this area here. And I know that we're in a time crunch, so thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm glad we made it through, and have a great day. We'll now go to question and answers.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you, Casey and Nikki. We really appreciate the time that you spent on putting these together and sharing it with us. I just want to see if there's any questions in the room. We also have a couple questions from the virtual attendees.
So I really enjoyed all your presentations. That was fascinating, really wonderful. My question is broadly about perceptions of climate change. As you know, the United States, we've got a lot of diversity of views about climate change. And I'm wondering, is among your tribes, do you have people who are sort of resistant to the idea that climate change is happening or that it's caused by humans? Thanks.
I can think about that a little bit, and personally, I haven't yet come across anyone who's specifically said climate change is not real or is not happening. The only challenge I can think of that that does come up is within our tribal nation we have many priorities and concerns, and kind of a feeling sometimes of not enough resources to address all of them. And sometimes what can happen is there's definitely acknowledgement of the impacts of climate change and that's happening, but there could be something happening that may seem to be a more immediate, like, emergency, and the staff and resources and focus can kind of be on that. And climate change is like a creeping, if you will, issue. It's still happening, but if other immediate things, I'll just give one quick example. So last year, 2020, of course, the pandemic was the big concern in getting resources to address that. But the U.S. Department of the Interior removed our tribal nations' lands out of trust. And that was like our emergency at that time, and our focus on addressing that, and which is resolving now in the kind of new administration, which seems good. So I'll conclude by saying I haven't come across anyone yet that's like it's not happening, but the challenge is we have other things occurring that are also emergencies within our tribal nations that we're kind of responding to. So I'll just say that. Thank you.
Right, and I would just say that really I would echo the same sentiment. It's not that people in the community doubt that it's taking place. It really is a matter of where you can put your attention and your effort, and then you have to basically, they just trust the people that are working on it. So they're just kind of like, well, that's being looked at over there. So it's not that they're in denial that it's happening or that they don't believe it's happening. It's just not in the forefront of that individual day-to-day personal life, I guess you would say. And I do want to say that one of the things, though, is that it's there are some of the climate vulnerabilities, stressors that are impacting Shinnecock that are a little more immediate and in your face. So they recognize that, realize that, and want to address that. And then there are some of the more subtle things that are kind of like, that's, it's not of the urgency. And then, in my work perspective, though, when I acknowledge that people don't see it as an urgency, I do, though, make it my responsibility to kind of continue making sure that it stays on the table, if you will, and so that it doesn't get pushed too far to the wayside, because it may not be something that we need to look at in our time, but it's something that definitely needs to be looked at for the future. So I think we're all aware of it. It's just a matter of how you can really prioritize it and process it in your individual daily life.
Okay. We have one other question I'd like to see. Does anyone else in the room have any questions? All right, so we have a question from a virtual attendee. When you partner with non-native organizations in your work, what are the greatest challenges in those collaborations and communications?
I think I can address that. So, first and foremost is just a mutual understanding of each other's positions and responsibilities. So that it takes time to learn about one another and to try to understand or put yourself in each other's shoes, or we'll always say like our moccasins, kind of looking at how we're approaching this. So I think one thing I work with on occasion is, climate adaptation science centers are both like federally supported, but also nested at universities and research centers. And the kind of work culture or relationships or level of accountability might be different than in like a tribal nation area. And so getting the understanding of that is what kind of, it takes time. So those who are doing research have like an obligation from maybe their employer to publish and to present research results and to kind of continue in that way of life. And sometimes there's like time pressures on that. In the tribal nation space, like kind of thinking about, when I worked for our tribal nation's natural resources, that's not something that was asked of me or required of me to like work and research and publish. But what was asked of me was to try to get some immediate issues and concerns addressed by our tribal community. And there's only so many hours in a day. So that like requires the focus. So sometimes in collaborations, you're working together with kind of sometimes varying values and priorities. And so trying to hash that out and find that middle ground of like those you're working with can like satisfy some of their requirements, but you also satisfy as like, say, a tribal nation director or staff, your requirements to meet the priorities of your community. So finding that middle ground is sometimes a challenge.
I guess one thing I would say is sometimes it's something as simple as recognizing that the speed and the way which some decisions are made are not on the same time frame. Sometimes I think that non-tribal members outside of our community think that it takes us a little while to make decisions, but that's because the way the majority of our decisions that are made, particularly ones that have big lasting impact on the community, are made by consensus. So it's not just one person says, yes, we're going to go and do that. It has to be discussed, and we have to agree that this is what's best. And so sometimes I think people are like, well, how do you not know the answer to that yet? And I'm like, well, because it's still being discussed. And not saying that things aren't done in an expedient manner when we know that there's a pressing deadline, but people need to recognize that it's going to take time to make those decisions because, like I said, the nature of how decisions are made. So I would add that's something that sometimes has never had any negative impact in my experience, but it's just something that has to be recognized when we're working with our partners, that decisions are not always a next day turnaround. So.
We are getting short on time. We have a couple more questions that I'd like to put out there. So one is addressed to Siobhan, and it's from Catherine from Emergence in Shinnecock. In your nation, if the wetlands are expected to migrate inland, what are the options for responding?
Could you repeat the question one more time? I couldn't quite hear it.
Wetlands are expected to migrate. Can you hear me, Siobhan? Okay. I'm gonna try a different microphone. Okay. How's this? Can you hear me now? Okay. It's about if Shinnecock wetlands are expected to migrate inland, what are the options for responding?
There it is. I think that's for you, Siobhan.
Your options for responding. So options for responding, honestly, is what we're exploring right now. I'm actually not a wetland specialist, and so I can't directly answer that question. I just know that it's happening, and because, like I said, given the nature of how small the remaining land base is that we have, but also acknowledging that it's a natural phenomenon that we basically are going to have to adapt to, right? I don't know that it would be preventing it, but it would be an adaptation. And so we already have in place where we don't build in the wetlands, and we never have. But now that the wetlands would be moving into, and we actually already see it in some people's yards, the plants that are growing in the area are changing. Now it becomes a short of moving the house. I really can't. I really can't answer that question. It's something that I have to learn more about personally before I can actually answer it. And so that's why I said that's where we're moving towards. And fortunately, we actually we have a couple of projects that are coming down the pike that will help us explore exactly this subject. And then I'll be able to speak more on it and have more of a definitive answer for the plan.